Hello everyone and welcome back to my studio, where today I'm going to show you some useful and fun tips and techniques for drawing cherries with coloured pencil. I began my cherries on pastel matte and I'm using Prismacolor Premier coloured pencils. Pastel matte is not a typical surface for coloured pencil work. One would usually think of perhaps a Bristol smooth paper or maybe a hot press watercolour paper, but in this instance I knew I'd be applying solvent, and I had created a video to test paper surfaces for solvent use before, and the results showed that coloured pencils with pastel matte and solvent provided the most saturation with really vibrant colours, so I went with it again. And I'm beginning with the stems. I'm first using an artichoke colour and adding in some brown, and this is going to be my first layer. Now for the highlights in both cherries, I'm adding some white, even though the surface is white, and the reason for this is that the white will act like a mask and kind of protect that area, as I want it to be as bright as possible. And you'll also notice that I'm adding in some grey. Pale greys are great colours to use with coloured pencil work. They can add highlights, but without the stark contrast of the main highlights that I want. And as I add my reds, I'm working in all the areas that have bright red in my reference, and I found it was just easiest with a small piece of artwork to work in sections. So wherever there was a bright red, I placed that down, as I knew I'd be building another layer over that to really bring out the vibrancy, and I also knew that everything would be blended in later to soften any harsh edges. And then I added a layer of pink, and all my layering at this stage is done with a very light pressure, like really light, grazing the paper just to add a hint of colour, nothing more. And I'm adding singular strokes to achieve that, not scrubbing back and forth. And the main purpose here is to achieve even coverage, and I just want to add an entire layer of pigment to establish my highlights, my lights and my darks, and to create the main shapes. Lastly, I add my darker reds and a black grape colour for the darkest hues. Once my first layer was complete, I came in with some solvent using a small brush. Solvent provides a painterly effect, and it eliminates any graininess that's inherent in coloured pencil use. It speeds up the length of time it takes, as when you add solvent, you don't need to keep adding layer after layer after layer or burnish, which can be hard work. Solvent's not for everyone because it is a toxic substance, but I use a very tiny amount, and a little goes a very long way. I like to transfer my solvent into a small screw-top container. It's easier to access it that way. And here I'm applying it using an old brush I don't want to use for anything else. So I dip my brush in the solvent, dab off the excess against the edge of the container, and then I also wipe off more on a piece of paper towel, and I swirl the brush a little bit to keep the point sharp. Less is really more with solvent, and what happens when solvent is applied to coloured pencil is that the pigment breaks down, and you can watch this happen before your eyes. You want to be careful and light-handed with your approach and application. I'm very careful with my edges, as it's going to be impossible to remove the pigment if I stray too far outside the outlines, and I'm stroking the paper gently. You can see how the solvent is creating the painterly effect here, and I'm also applying the solvent in the shape of the curve of the cherry, following the slight curve I created with the coloured pencils in the previous layer. Now, using too much solvent can be problematic, as you can end up with a streaky mess and you'll just be chasing the pigment around. By adding just a tiny amount, you can control where the pigment goes. I'm keeping everything light, as I'll be going in with another layer of coloured pencil and another layer of solvent, and I'm avoiding the highlighted areas. The best technique to use here is singular strokes. Because of using solvent, I was able to complete this cherry in only 90 minutes. It would have taken longer if I had created several layers without the solvent to blend all the colours. This 90-minute cherry study is one of my Patreon tutorials, and Patreon is a commitment-free subscription from only $1 a week, and in each tutorial I show you how to create beautiful, detailed, colourful and realistic art in real time so you can follow along. My lessons will teach you how to create with graphite, charcoal, coloured pencil, pastel pencil, pan pastels, acrylic and airbrush. Each tutorial is fully narrated and I share my reference, line art and a full supply list. To get sneak previews of each tutorial to see my teaching style, just hit the link in the description box below. One layer of solvent isn't usually enough. I like to add 2 or 3, and for this study only 2 were needed. And you can see how the solvent blends and then decide for yourself whether you need another layer. This pastel matte surface can take a lot of solvent as well as a lot of coloured pencil layers. And once that first layer of solvent is placed down, I let it dry thoroughly. It does need to dry completely before the second application of coloured pencil. And it takes about 10 minutes or so, depending on your climate. So I then come in with a second layer, and at this point we're now in what we call the ugly phase. The first layer's gone and it doesn't look terribly realistic and needs a whole lot more blending. Coloured pencil work and all artwork go through the ugly stage and you start to wonder what went wrong. Nothing's wrong. All that's needed is to keep going with that second layer. And I'm adding lots of darks, and for this I'm adding some lilacs as well, and then more solvent to that layer as well. And that layer with the solvent that has dried now is staying put. It won't erase and it won't move, so your subsequent layer will just go right on top. And that's why it's important to use a paper with lots of available tooth and to keep those layers light. It really helps to keep pencils sharp all the time as well. I use different sharpeners for different artwork, and I like electric sharpeners when I'm using coloured pencils. And my 2 favourite coloured pencil sharpeners are the iPoint Halo and the X-Acto School Pro. They're both helical sharpeners and shut off after they reach a fine point. You'll find yourself sharpening really frequently, and these ones are quick and you can keep them right by your work. And if you find you've been a little heavy-handed, you can use a kneaded eraser to lift some of the pigment back up. Press down and lift off. All you can do is lighten, but it can make a difference and it won't hurt the tooth of the paper. On your second application of solvent, you need even less than the first time around. I added 2 layers before my third layer of coloured pencil, and you could add more if you want, but I didn't feel the need. You can really see with this second layer that the cherry's starting to take shape and that everything's beginning to blend together with the pigments that I laid down. You can take a lot more chances with your colours when you're adding solvent because you can achieve some really great blends. When I go in with the solvent, I try not to contaminate the different colours together, so I'm careful with what I'm doing. The solvent makes the pigment kind of malleable, so you do have to be a bit careful. And I also make sure I blend until the brush is dry before I re-dip again. Now, anytime you add coloured pencil, even on the top of solvent, you're going to get graininess. So I blended out the final layer with a white pencil, re-establishing some of my highlights and brightening everything up. This is also a really good time to reshape any areas that aren't quite correct. And as always, I'm looking at my reference all the time. And I used the grey pencil to blend as well. And what the grey pencil does is it knocks down some of the colour and acts kind of like a glaze. And then finally I went in and added some darker tones to get the polished look to the cherries to help give them the shine that I wanted. And just before I finish, I use a colourless blender to really refine everything. And since I'm using wax-based pencils, a colourless blender is just the wax without the colour, so it means you can blend colours into each other without affecting the colours underneath. I used a firmer pressure now to make sure that the pigment was really getting all the way into the tooth of the paper, right into all the peaks and valleys of the surface. And I'm using oval motions. Not all of that graininess is a bad thing, as it can add some really lovely textures into your work. And you can use a kneaded eraser to clean up any tiny particles and lift any unwanted pigment, and you're all finished. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that little notification bell so that you can stay alerted to my new content. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.